Okay, let's unpack this. If we were searching for a single day, it's a snapshot that perfectly captured this sort of high wire tension and the systemic risks of modern global life. Well, the sources we've looked at really point squarely at October 20, 2025.
Yeah, it wasn't just one big thing, was it?
No, not at all. It was this complex, simultaneous mix. You had catastrophic technological failure happening alongside historic civic mobilization, particularly in the U.S., and then these deep diplomatic ruptures cracking open all across the geopolitical map.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is the way these, well, seemingly localized incidents immediately cascaded. They rippled outwards into global consequences, and it just vividly illustrated the essential fragility, of these modern hyper-connected systems we rely on.
Exactly. We've synthesized, 15 distinct sources here?
That's right, 15. And they range from detailed tech postmortems and dense government budget analyses all the way to diplomatic cables and, claims from protest organizers. Our mission here is really to distill all of that down into clear, actionable knowledge for you.
And the core theme, the thread running through all of it.
It's this clash, isn't it? The simultaneous concentration of risk. Think about that severe over-reliance on single cloud platforms colliding head-on with this, radical dispersion of power. You see that in the massive street protests, the shifts in global alliances. It's happening all at once.
Right. So we need to look at this day not just as like a series of random unfortunate events, but as a critical stress test, a test on the core functions of modern governance, modern infrastructure.
Can the digital foundation handle the strain?
Yeah. And at the same time, can the political institutions handle this pressure cooker of partisan gridlock and this unprecedented level of public dissent? Let's start where the system truly buckled first, that catastrophic failure of the digital backbone, something felt by almost everyone almost instantly. We are, of course, talking about that major Amazon Web Services outage, the AWS Cascade failure. I mean, the sources make it undeniably clear just how critical this stuff is. AWS isn't just, a server farm somewhere.
No, it's the backbone. It's the indispensable backbone for thousands upon thousands of websites, applications, services worldwide.
And the incident was huge. It centered specifically in the U.S. East 1 region, right?
That's right. And for anyone not familiar, US East 1. But it's basically the biggest chunk of internet real estate in the world. A failure there isn't just regional.
It's global. Instantly.
Instantly. Because the modern internet operates on this incredibly concentrated architecture, that failure immediately triggered these widespread outages, slowdowns, you name it. We saw banking systems just seize up. Government portals went dark.
Social media too, right? Snapchat, Reddit.
Yep. Major platforms failed to load, and massive gaming platforms like Fortnite just became unplayable. You're talking hundreds of thousands of businesses, millions of individuals just cut off from critical digital services for hours.
And I think the most important nugget of knowledge, the key takeaway here, has to be the cause. Because when something this massive happens, the immediate fear is,
cyber attack.
Yeah, a sophisticated nation-state attack, a cyber Pearl Harbor scenario.
Yeah.
But the sources, they traced the problem not to some external aggressor, but to an internal operational error.
Precisely. That's the crucial point. The root cause was identified as a technical failure within their own internal load balancer monitoring system. Now, think of a load balancer as basically the traffic cop for digital services, right? It makes sure no single server gets overwhelmed.
Okay.
Well, the monitoring mechanism that's responsible for managing this traffic itself failed, and it failed because of a configuration error. So this wasn't malware, it wasn't a breach. It was a technical misstep, a flaw in the digital plumbing, if you like.
And that then just cascaded.
Rapidly.
Huh.
Across all the dependent services worldwide, the irony is just, the mechanism designed specifically to ensure stability was the exact trigger for the collapse.
Wow. And this leads directly to that core implication everyone's talking about, concentration risk. I mean, for nearly a decade now, we've seen regulators, digital rights groups, security experts, they've all been sounding the alarm.
Yeah, they warned that critical public infrastructure, we were talking everything from healthcare data management to energy grid monitoring, was increasingly being centralized. It was being run on just a handful of private clouds.
With limited public oversight and, crucially, not enough mandated redundancy.
And this AWS outage, It validated those warnings emphatically, didn't it? It immediately reignited this global debate over what actually constitutes critical third-party infrastructure.
Right, because if a single commercial platform can take down critical services for multiple governments and global financial
Then
systems,
shouldn't that platform be subject to some kind of specialized regulation, similar to, say, banks or power grids?
it completely changes the regulatory conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the immediate response from policymakers was pretty instructive. UK officials, for example, they were quick to announce, direct engagement with Amazon on resilience issues. They were demanding faster notification, better contingency planning.
And in the U.S., the inquiries focused heavily on mandating diversification. Experts are urging companies, governments, everyone really, to move away from relying on just one provider. To use multiple clouds, that strategy known as multi-cloud, specifically to reduce these single points of failure.
But that's easier said than done, right?
Oh, absolutely. The problem with that solution is, well, time and expense. Migrating complex systems, especially older legacy government systems, across different competing cloud architectures. That's a
Wow.
massive undertaking, multi-year, multi-billion-dollar stuff.
So while the diagnosis concentration risk is crystal clear,
The practical cure is slow, and it's fraught with its own integration risks.
look, the entire world just got a fresh, pretty painful, and definitely economically costly lesson in just how vulnerable you become when you centralize everything.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting analytically. This paradox that kind of challenges our basic understanding of instability. You've got the technical foundation of the country literally buckling under the strain.
Yeah, digital chaos everywhere. And yet, if you look at the immediate economic context, there was this profound, almost shocking decoupling from the chaos.
You'd absolutely expect markets to just crater, right? Massive technical failures happening at the same time as a protracted government shutdown. I mean, that's the textbook definition of economic uncertainty.
But the sources show U.S. stocks actually saw broad gains that day. The S&P 500 and the NASDAQ, they advanced roughly 1.5%, pushing them near record territory. It demands a deeper explanation. Why did the market just shrug off a simultaneous digital and governmental failure?
Well, we have to look closely at where the money was actually moving. A major factor seems to have been the, well, seemingly impenetrable strength of the mega caps,
Okay.
especially big tech.
Like Apple.
Exactly. Apple, which is often seen as this bellwether for global consumption, it actually hit a record high that day. That followed some upbeat analyst upgrades and positive indicators about strong iPhone sales. Investors, it seems, were betting on the resilience of these corporate behemoths, not on the stability of the government.
They were bidding up what analysts call cyclical names, too, and regional banks, companies that are usually sensitive to the economic cycle, which suggests confidence in future growth, almost ignoring the immediate policy paralysis in Washington.
Precisely. The prevailing investor sentiment was clearly focused on the perceived resilience of profits from these mega caps and, consumer staples companies seen as insulated from the political drama in D.C. And critically, Treasury yields.
The barometer of safety.
Right, the barometer of safety and stability in the U.S. financial system. They remained remarkably steady. The 10-year yield hovered near 4%.
Okay, maybe just unpack that for the listener. Why is that 10-year yield number so crucial during this kind of chaos?
Right. So the stability of the 10-year Treasury note is a really vital indicator. It represents the borrowing rate the U.S. government pays over the long term, and, it's the global benchmark for risk-free assets. If investors truly believe the government shutdown or the AWS outage pose some kind of catastrophic long-term threat,
You see movement there.
absolutely. We'd probably see a flight into treasuries, driving the yield dramatically down as people sought safety. Or, even more concerningly, maybe a flight out of U.S. debt altogether, pushing yields up. The fact that the yield remains stable, around 4%, it signals that large institutional investors basically viewed the political gridlock as temporary noise.
Annoying, but temporary.
Exactly. Completely disconnected from the core profitability of major corporations. Their confidence, it seems, was squarely in corporate America, not political Washington.
And that profound disconnect between capital and governance, well, brings us directly to Washington, where the political impasse was reaching truly historic proportions. Let's pivot now to that protracted government shutdown.
Yeah, the sources confirm this federal funding lapse was now among the longest in modern U.S. history. It reached its 20th day.
Day 20, making it the third longest ever recorded.
Third longest ever. I mean, the legislative process wasn't just stalled, it had completely seized up. It was acting like this functional vacuum right at the heart of the U.S. administrative state.
And we saw the Senate fail again, right? Their 11th attempt to advance some kind of measure failed, falling well short of the 60 votes they needed to overcome the procedural hurdles.
The vote tally was 50-43. It just reinforces that these deep partisan trenches remained completely unbreachable. This wasn't just, a typical political squabble anymore.
No, it felt different.
It felt like a demonstration that the traditional levers of legislative compromise had just vanished.
And the core dispute itself was deeply complex. It went far beyond simple budget numbers, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The breakdown really centered on these extreme partisan divisions over policy riders.
Okay, explain those. What are policy riders in this context?
So these are specific, often controversial, non-budgetary policy changes that get attached to essential spending bills. Kind of like hitching a ride. And the fight was over those and also the basic scoop of any stopgap bill just to keep the lights on. Plus, you had the president issuing repeated vetoes against even bipartisan funding measures, demanding further, really sweeping policy concessions and significant spending cuts.
That the Senate Democrats absolutely refused to countenance.
Right. They saw it as capitulation to executive overreach and basically the wholesale dismantling of critical social programs through the back door of the appropriations process.
So it became symbolic.
Highly symbolic. This made the negotiation a battle for the very integrity of the legislative branch itself, not just a fight over a dollar amount here or there.
And meanwhile, the tangible costs were just mounting day by day. This is where the dysfunction really hits real life, isn't it?
It is. You had thousands upon thousands of federal workers, either unpaid or furloughed, crippling the basic functions of government.
Essential services impacted.
Absolutely. Agencies responsible for things like food assistance programs, transportation safety oversight, even border security agencies, they were operating with minimal staff or just forced to send employees home. And beyond that, national labs, critical energy programs, they began deep furloughs, literally halting vital scientific research.
And economic data delays, too.
Crucially, yes. Routine economic data releases, think inflation numbers, jobs reports, stuff the Federal Reserve and financial markets rely on, they were being delayed. So the very economic data that would normally help us understand the depth of the crisis, it just wasn't available, deepening the uncertainty.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, this standoff was far more than just some physical dispute.
It had transformed, hadn't it, into this symbolic battleground over the basic ability of the U.S. government to even function, to maintain governance. We were witnessing this profound self-inflicted failure of Washington to operate basic functions, while the economic drag, the scientific drag, just mounted every single day.
And this vacuum of governance, this paralysis at the top, it happened right alongside this massive mobilization on the streets, the No Kings rallies.
Yeah, the scale of these protests seems genuinely historic, setting a new kind of benchmark for civic action, maybe in the digital age. Organizers were claiming nearly 7 million people turned out.
Okay, I have to push back on that number, though. 7 million people. That sounds immense. Isn't that estimate likely, inherently inflated? And if it is, how does that change the political pressure calculation?
Look, that's a necessary challenge. And yes, turnout estimates for any mass mobilization are almost always contested and often inflated by the organizers themselves. That's standard. But even if you take more conservative third-party estimates, this event was still unquestionably one of the largest single-day protest mobilizations in U.S. history.
Really? Even with lower numbers?
Yeah. When you compare the sheer scope, the geographic spread thousands of sites nationwide to historical benchmarks like the 1960s civil rights marches or the big anti-war protests, the scale, sustained over the day, was historic. You simply can't dismiss the number of affiliated demonstrations happening simultaneously across the country.
Okay. So whether it was exactly 7 million or maybe slightly less, the mobilization itself was enormous. What were the drivers? What brought so many people out across such diverse locations?
The sources indicate the grievances were pretty broad, but they seem to crystallize around these shared, almost existential concerns. The central theme was clearly opposition to perceived authoritarianism and recent executive actions that were viewed as excessive.
So democracy concerns.
Deep democracy concerns, yeah. Specifically around executive overreach, crackdowns on dissent. But that was alongside long-standing grievances people had related to immigration policy, the state of healthcare access. It was like a fusion of different resistance movements coming together under this single banner of democratic defense.
And we also have some specific demographic data, at least from the Washington, D.C. event, which adds a bit more texture.
We do. The profile of the D.C. participants, based on analysis of things like on-site registration and surveys, it skewed predominantly female, white, and middle-aged. and with a very strong left-leaning political identification.
What does that profile tell us?
Well, it underscores a highly engaged, likely well-organized base. A base that isn't just motivated, but probably has the resources and, importantly, the history of participation needed to sustain this kind of mobilization over time. This wasn't just a one-off burst of anger.
And the political tension coming out of this was interesting too, because it wasn't just aimed at one party, was it? It seemed to target both sides of the aisle.
Absolutely. You had supporters of the rally arguing, look, these mass peaceful demonstrations, they pressure elected officials. They pressure them to resolve the shutdown, to defend democratic institutions, to check presidential power. That was one view.
But the critics,
Critics, including actually some voices from within the Democratic Party establishment, they dismissed the turnout claims as inflated and argued, well, street protests don't actually change the congressional math needed to override a veto or pass a bill.
right?
But maybe more importantly, the action fueled this sustained frustration that targeted both the Republican gridlock and what many participants clearly viewed as insufficient, maybe timid pushback from Democrats against those executive actions they were protesting.
So it reinforces this sense that maybe the public, or at least this very large mobilized segment of it, is losing faith in both branches of the political establishment.
That's certainly the feeling you get from the sources. Yeah, a deep frustration with the entire system.
Okay, let's shift our focus now from that domestic paralysis to the global volatility, because October 20th was also a day of really intense diplomatic activity and some dangerous flare-ups across several critical geopolitical fault lines. Let's start with the incredibly fragile truce in Gaza.
Yeah, fragile is definitely the word. This U.S. brokered truce, which came after 2 long years of intensive conflict, was under immense strain. The very fact that high-stakes U.S. envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff had to basically rush to Israel on this specific day, well, it underscores just how close that ceasefire was to completely collapsing.
They were there to reinforce it, right, to try and shore it up.
Exactly. And their rush came right after a severe flare-up. We saw renewed rocket attacks coming from Hamas, which were then quickly met with retaliatory Israeli strikes. Those strikes killed dozens in Gaza.
And predictably, both sides blamed the other.
Immediately. Both were quick to accuse the other of flagrant violations of the agreement. It's the classic dangerous cycle.
And the political and humanitarian stakes in this situation are just critically high, aren't they?
Enormous. The deaths of 2 Israeli soldiers down in Rafah led to an immediate suspension of critical aid deliveries into Gaza, cited as a security measure. This, of course, just compounded the already dire humanitarian distress in Gaza, where the population relies so heavily on those external supplies.
So the envoy's focus was?
The U.S. envoy's public statements focused heavily on the need for enforcement of the ceasefire terms. They explicitly linked security guarantees to the resumption of humanitarian delivery, which is always a precarious linkage, isn't it? It often makes aid itself into a political bargaining chip.
And the international reactions really reveal the depth of the division in the region.
They do. Pro-ceasefire advocates, the UN, several European nations, they immediately urged the U.S. and other regional powers to use maximum leverage to get that aid flowing again quickly. They warned of a severe humanitarian catastrophe looming.
While the hardliners.
Meanwhile, regional hardliners were openly expressing doubt that Hamas would ever truly disarm or fully accept the new security framework being proposed. They were essentially suggesting this truce was merely a pause, a temporary lull, before a resumption of full-scale fighting. The sources really paint this picture of diplomacy happening minute by minute, constantly in danger of being completely derailed by just one more isolated incident.
Okay, moving next, we see the continued pressure and the sheer diplomatic complexity surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war, particularly this concept of peace at any cost.
Yeah, the reporting on this day really centered on the U.S. involvement, specifically with President Trump reportedly urging Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to seriously consider making significant territorial concessions to Vladimir Putin in exchange for a ceasefire.
Which puts Zelensky just in a possible position, surely, trying to defend sovereignty while potentially losing critical military backing from his main supporter.
Exactly. And Zelensky's response was, well, very measured, but also quite telling. He signaled an openness to perhaps joining a potential Trump-Putin summit, maybe in Hungary if he were invited. But at the same time, he publicly voiced his disappointment at not receiving requested U.S. military aid, specifically mentioning Tomahawk missiles.
So it shows the pressure he's under. He's trying to navigate this strategic relationship that is clearly becoming very transactional.
Very transactional. And that transactional nature prompted some sharp, very public pushback from key European allies. Officials in Poland and Germany were particularly vocal. They argued that pressuring the victim of aggression Ukraine to surrender territory was just wholly inappropriate and that it set a dangerous precedent for international law.
They warned against peace at any cost.
Precisely. If that cost involved effectively rewarding the aggressor for their actions.
Now, tying directly into this conflict is this massive, long-term strategic move by the European Union on the energy front. It seems they're really making their break with Moscow official and binding.
This is arguably one of the most consequential strategic decisions detailed in the sources for that day. EU energy ministers agreed on a negotiating position that essentially mandates phasing out all Russian gas contracts entirely by January 1st, 2028.
Wow, that's a hard deadline.
It is, and it follows what's been a remarkably successful rapid diversification effort, obviously spurred by the initial invasion of Ukraine.
Can you give us the before and after picture on that dependency?
Sure. Before the full-scale conflict really kicked off, Russia supplied something like 45% of the EU's total gas needs. Immense dependency. Today, according to these reports, that share is down to about 12%.
That's a huge drop.
A massive drop. And this new agreement effectively locks in that break. It serves as a huge strategic blow to Russia's long-term war financing model. It signals this definitive, coordinated move by the EU to redirect investment away from Russia and into other sources.
Like LNG, renewables.
Exactly. Increased LNG import infrastructure, accelerated renewable energy projects, and massive expansion of gas storage capabilities across all the member states. The EU is, in effect, weaponizing its energy policy to try and inflict lasting economic damage on the Kremlin.
Okay, so while Europe moves strategically away from Moscow, U.S. relations with a key South American partner, Colombia, seem to have just blown up into a full-blown diplomatic crisis.
Yeah, the situation deteriorated incredibly rapidly into a major U.S.-Colombia diplomatic rupture. The clearest signal was Colombia recalling its ambassador to Washington, Daniel Garcia Peña, for consultations. That's a serious diplomatic step.
And the trigger was?
It seems to have been a sort of 1-2 punch. First, some really sharp rhetoric, and then military action.
The rhetoric was highly inflammatory, wasn't it? President Trump accusing Colombian President Gustavo Petro of being an illegal drug leader and publicly vowing to raise tariffs, cut critical U.S. aid.
Right, and this followed U.S. strikes on vessels out at sea that Washington claimed were tied to drug trafficking operations. Bogotá responded with absolute fury, condemning those strikes as a severe violation of their national sovereignty. They also accused the U.S. of causing civilian casualties during the operation.
What are the real-world economic stakes here? This sudden collapse in cooperation must have consequences.
The stakes are enormous. First off, the U.S. is Colombia's top trading partner, by far. So the threat of steep tariff hikes immediately spooked the markets, causing Colombia's currency, the peso, to slip significantly intraday.
But it goes beyond just trade, doesn't it?
Much beyond. This conflict threatens to unravel literally decades of deeply entrenched cooperation on things like counter-narcotics efforts, regional security intelligence sharing. If that U.S. aid is cut, and if that security cooperation fractures, both countries suddenly face a significantly more complicated and probably more dangerous security landscape in the region.
And finally, on the geopolitical front, that global trade war between the U.S. and China seems to be intensifying again, focusing narrowly now on the highest-end, most advanced technology.
Yeah, the U.S. unveiled new, quite targeted export restrictions. These were aimed specifically at advanced semiconductors, the really cutting-edge chips, and also certain AI-related technologies, preventing their sale to China. The stated justification, as always, is national security.
Preventing China from getting the computational power needed for advanced military applications, presumably.
That's the official line. But the immediate fallout wasn't just diplomatic. It was intensely domestic in the U.S., too.
How so?
Well, U.S. business lobbies, groups like the American Chamber of Commerce, but also major tech multinationals, especially those involved in chip design and production, they immediately protested these new restrictions.
What was their argument?
They warned that these really granular controls could severely cripple U.S. firms' global competitiveness. They might have to downgrade earnings forecasts. And paradoxically, they argued it could actually accelerate China's own drive toward complete technological self-sufficiency, ultimately deepening these global decoupling trends that worry businesses so much.
So it forces this crucial choice, doesn't it? Is the perceived immediate security benefit worth the potential long-term cost of losing market share and maybe driving your main competitor to achieve total independence faster?
That is the absolute central policy question here. And Chinese officials, for their part, they predictably condemned the move, calling it illegal economic warfare. This policy isn't just about controlling today's technology, it's really about controlling the standards, the supply chains of the future. And this kind of escalation threatens to create two entirely separate, maybe incompatible technological ecosystems globally.
Okay, let's look south again for a moment and examine a really significant political shift, one that promises to reshape South American alliances. The Bolivian election results came in.
That's right. Bolivia just concluded its presidential runoff, and it marked a definitive end to 2 decades of dominance by the left-wing MAS movement, the party of Evo Morales. Centrist Senator Rodrigo Paz won a pretty decisive victory, over 54% of the vote, defeating his opponent, Jorge Tuto Quiroga. This is a dramatic ideological pivot for Bolivia.
And Paz campaigned on a platform he defined as popular capitalism and anti-corruption. What does popular capitalism actually mean in the context of post-MAS Bolivia?
Well, in that specific context, popular capitalism seems to be positioned as a direct rejection of the nationalization policies and the heavy state control that really defined the MAS era, especially in key sectors.
So less state intervention.
Exactly. It means prioritizing private investment, reducing that heavy-handed state intervention in major industries like mining and natural gas, and implementing more fiscally conservative policies aimed squarely at controlling inflation, which has been a major public concern.
And restoring ties with Washington was part of it, too.
Explicitly. Paz campaigned clearly on restoring the strained diplomatic and economic ties with Washington. He was clearly capitalizing on this widespread public disillusionment that had been fueled by high inflation, persistent fuel shortages, and just increasing fiscal stress under the previous government.
So the economic hardship, combined with maybe a desire for closer U.S. ties, drove this swing to the center right. But governing isn't going to be easy for him, is it?
No, definitely not. Analysts were very quick to caution that despite having this decisive popular mandate from the election, Paz actually lacks a legislative majority in Congress. This forces him immediately into that difficult, often frustrating, process of coalition building just to enact his key reforms.
Especially the tough ones.
Particularly those concerning politically sensitive issues like phasing out the costly, long-standing fuel subsidies. That's a measure that, historically in Bolivia, has been prone to triggering massive civil unrest. So a tough road ahead for him.
Okay, now for something completely different and quite shocking. The Louvre heist. Paris woke up on this day to the news of one of the most audacious museum robberies in French history.
Yeah, audacious is the right word. The sources detail a scenario that honestly sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie. A small, clearly highly coordinated crew executed the entire operation in just 7 minutes.
7 minutes.
They used an external vehicle lift, like the kind used for construction or window washing, to reach a second-floor window of the Apollo Gallery, completely bypassing all the ground-level security measures. Once they were inside, they targeted and smashed specific display cases, stealing 8 pieces described as incalculable from the Napoleonic crown jewels collection.
That 7-minute window just speaks volumes about the planning, the precision involved, and the cultural value of these pieces must be absolutely immense.
Oh, astronomical. The haul reportedly included tiaras and other jewelry sets linked directly to Empresses Marie-Louise and Eugénie. These are pieces of profound French national and cultural heritage. The theft immediately reignited this global debate over security standards for high-value artifacts, especially when faced with these kinds of non-traditional entry methods.
And the fear is they'll be broken up.
That's the deep concern investigators always have in these cases. That the pieces will be broken down, the gems sold off separately on the black market. It's a common practice that unfortunately complicates recovery immensely because it destroys the historical integrity of the pieces forever.
Okay, shifting from crime to royal and political accountability. We have news from the British monarchy concerning Prince Andrew. He announced he would cease using his royal titles, including the prominent Duke of York, following consultations with King Charles III.
Right. This move appeared entirely proactive, and it was framed by Buckingham Palace officials specifically as the right course of action. The explicit goal stated was to shield the monarchy itself from ongoing, highly damaging controversy.
And the timing was crucial, wasn't it?
Absolutely paramount. It came just days, literally days ahead of the anticipated release of Virginia Giuffre's memoir. Her allegations against the prince, which he continues to vehemently deny, were expected to dominate headlines. So this decision was clearly aimed at containing the reputational fallout before the book actually hit the shelves.
Can you just clarify the technicality here? He's ceasing use of the titles, but he hasn't been formally stripped of them.
That's an important distinction, yes. The sources point out that his peerages, like the Dukedom of York, are not being legally stripped by the government or by Parliament. That would require a specific, quite complex legal process. Instead, the titles will officially lie dormant.
So he's still technically Prince Andrew.
He remains technically a prince, yes. But the active use of those specific ducal titles, the ones associated with public duties and appearances, is suspended indefinitely. It's essentially an internal royal family mechanism designed to manage public perception and political pressure without triggering a full-blown constitutional crisis over stripping titles.
So we saw a somewhat similar, though obviously different, crisis of accountability playing out on the local political level over in Vermont in the U.S.
That's right. A prominent Republican state legislator there was forced to resign pretty much immediately after revelations linked him directly to participating in a racist and anti-Semitic private group chat.
And the reaction was swift.
The speed of the official response was notable. The state's Republican leadership swiftly and very publicly called for his immediate resignation. This prompted wider debates across Vermont about accountability, about party standards, and about the persistence of hate speech even in local and state politics.
Okay, let's try and end our review of this turbulent day by noting two quite opposing trends we saw in the sources. First, a really critical public health victory, but then also, disturbingly, an acceleration of extreme weather events.
Let's start with the positive news. That came from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The country announced it had discharged the last known patient from the latest Ebola outbreak, which was centered in Kasai province. This is a crucial, very hard-won milestone.
And it starts the clock, right?
It does. It begins that mandated 42-day countdown. If no new cases emerge during that period, the outbreak can be declared officially over.
Given the immense challenges of operating in remote regions like Kasai, what were the keys to this successful containment effort this time?
Well, the Kasai outbreak, which was declared back on September 4th, ultimately recorded 64 total cases, 53 confirmed, 11 probable, and tragically 43 deaths. But experts are highlighting the successful deployment of rapid diagnostics, getting results quickly. Also, extensive community engagement strategies, really working to build trust with local populations. And most importantly, the effectiveness of targeted vaccination strategies using the newer vaccines.
So lessons learned from previous outbreaks paying off.
Exactly. This outcome, achieved despite some severe logistical hurdles, really represents a major triumph for global health resilience. It shows preparedness, lessons learned from past, devastating outbreaks are being effectively applied.
Okay, but unfortunately, that optimism is definitely tempered by the news regarding climate impacts and infrastructure vulnerability. We saw significant extreme weather events globally on this day, highlighting that increased vulnerability.
Yeah, Tropical Storm Fengshen is a prime example. It slammed into the Philippines, killing at least 8 people, forcing tens of thousands to evacuate their homes, and causing widespread coastal flooding across Luzon Island. The Philippines is, of course, structurally vulnerable to these kinds of events, but the data suggests the increased frequency and the sheer intensity of rainfall are accelerating the damage and making recovery harder.
And then, perhaps more surprisingly, in a place traditionally less associated with this kind of severe weather, France saw a devastating and highly unusual event.
That's right. A powerful, destructive tornado ripped through the Île-de-France region, that's the densely populated area surrounding Paris. It killed at least 1 person and critically injured 4 others.
A tornado near Paris. That's rare.
Extremely rare, historically speaking. And this event, happening so far outside the historically expected climate patterns for that specific region, has prompted immediate urgent new calls from officials and experts there for improved climate adaptation planning and infrastructure resilience measures. They're having to reassess risks in areas previously considered relatively secure from this type of tornadic activity.
And finally, on this day, we also saw a major transportation safety incident. A Turkey-based cargo airline, ACT Airlines, had a Boeing 747 freighter skid off a runway at Hong Kong International Airport.
Yeah, a very serious incident. The plane crashed directly into the sea just off the end of the runway.
Were there casualties?
Tragically, yes. While the 4 crew members on the aircraft reportedly survived, 2 people who were in a security patrol vehicle on the ground near the runway were killed on impact when the plane hit them.
Awful.
Yeah.
So investigations will focus on.
This is going to immediately refocus intense scrutiny, intense attention on specific operation procedures at Hong Kong, which is one of Asia's busiest and most complex airports. Investigations will now center heavily on things like wet runway procedures, the handling of crosswind operations, which can be tricky there, and the overall approach stability protocols used, especially by large cargo aircraft like the 747. They'll need to ensure that all the necessary safety buffers were properly in place for operating in what can be one of the most challenging flight environments in the world. #outro.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back and try to look at the whole picture of this one day, October 20th, 2025. What have we seen? I think we've seen this defining snapshot of a world that's really struggling with dual, massive institutional risks, haven't we?
Absolutely. You have the centralized digital infrastructure failing spectacularly in the AWS outage.
And at the same time, the political government failing to even fund itself, grinding through its 20th day of shutdown paralysis. And all of this is happening while simultaneously you've got this deeply mobilized populace out in the streets demanding systemic change.
Yeah, the forces of concentration like that tech infrastructure are clearly being violently tested by these forces of dispersion, the protests, the fracturing alliances. We saw historic civic action against political gridlock. But crucially, that action took place on a technical infrastructure whose fundamental reliance on just a few single providers remains dangerously concentrated.
So the core issue of governance isn't just about political will anymore.
It seems not just, it's also about systemic architecture, both digital architecture and constitutional architecture. They're both under immense strain.
But I think the most confounding tension, the thing we really have to take away from this day is that ultimate disconnect playing out in the United States. We saw the U.S. stock market setting records, Apple leading the charge, operating under this assumption that somehow corporate profits are immune to all this chaos.
Even while the U.S. federal government failed to perform its most basic function, funding itself, grinding to its 20th day of paralysis.
It just seems fundamentally unstable.
It raises a powerful final question, I think, for you, the listener, to synthesize all these different events we've discussed. We saw earlier in the month, U.S. health workers achieve a major labor win after that Kaiser Permanente strike over staffing and pay. That demonstrated that organized labor can still force significant institutional change. Yet here on October 20th, the U.S. federal government remains crippled by its own self-inflicted shutdown.
And so the question is,
in a system where you have both major labor organizations and mass protests actively demonstrating for systemic change, pushing against the status quo, what institutional failure point, whether it's political gridlock, technological fragility like AWS, or maybe a diplomatic rupture like US Colombia, which one will ultimately define and reshape the coming months, where does the system finally break?
the pressure is clearly mounting on every single front. That's the deep dive for today.
We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these crucial fault lines.